Here we are back to Mr. Tucket. We are at chapter 21 and 22. This is the end of the book. On the ridge overlooking Spot Johnny's, Mr. Grimes pulled to a stop. Francis reined in beside him a second later. What met their eyes was total carnage. It means people were killed. There was death everywhere. Down below, all the buildings were on fire, including the storage sheds, and they were burning so fiercely that the snow around them was melted for more than 100 feet. Around the house area could be seen small humps like gray rocks scattered here and there. There were perhaps 20 of these humps, and with sudden shock, Francis realized that they were bodies. They rode down toward the house. Pawnees, Mr. Grimes said, examining several bodies. Braid and his boys. Above the burning trading post, toward the east about 2 miles, they now saw a wagon train of 20 or more wagons. These were not arranged in a circle, but scattered this way and that, and 2 of the wagons were burning. They looked like small torches in the snow. Mr. Grimes heeled footloose and started at a walk toward the house. His rifle was balanced across his lap, and his back was slouched in a way Francis had never seen. Francis followed. The pack horses automatically followed, and slowly the procession approached the trading post. There were bodies of Pawnee Indians everywhere. They lay as they had fallen, some running, some stretched out as though sleeping. I count 23, Mr. Grimes said. His voice was hollow. Old Spot put up a whale of a fight. They dismounted and searched the ground around the post, but could not find the bodies of Spot or his family. Maybe they got away, Francis offered, and made it over to the wagon train. No, Mr. Tucket. That's a nice thought, but there are too many dead braves around here. They wouldn't have let Spot get away. But they aren't out here. Francis' voice trailed off as his eyes went to the still burning house. The fire was roaring now as the pitch in the log walls started to burn. In there? Francis asked, pointing to the flames. Spot? Mr. Grimes gave a short nod. He stood for a moment watching the fire, breathing deeply. Then he broke off and studied the dead Indians on the ground. What are you looking for? Francis asked. The mountain man didn't answer. Presently he finished his examination, looked off across the hills, and mounted. Come on, Mr. Tucket, let's go talk to the farmers. When they were 100 yards from the wagon train, 3 men came out to meet them. 2 of them held rifles at the ready, the other one in the middle. A stocky man with red hair and a red face did the talking. Mr. Grimes dismounted again. They hit you long ago? He asked. Maybe an hour, maybe more. 15 or so came down on our wagons, and another 40 jumped the trading post. You lose many men? 2. Thing is, they kept us hopping while they nailed the post. We couldn't get out to help. Mr. Grimes nodded. They were after powder. Did anyone get out of the house? The stocky man shook his head. At least if they did, we didn't see 'em. Friends of yours? Mr. Grimes was quiet, staring at the snow-covered hills. I know how you feel, the man went on. One of the 2 we lost was my brother. There was silence for a while, and Francis realized that the stocky man was crying, but that his lips were moving back and forth in anger. Mr. Grimes broke the silence. Well, it appears that the time has come to do something about Braid. He turned to look at Francis. Remember me telling you, Mr. Tucket, that if I ever did kill Braid, it wouldn't be because he had something I wanted? This is different, Mr. Tucket, very different. He walked over to Footloose, removed the saddle, threw it on the ground, and mounted bareback. What's your name? He asked the stocky man. Groves, Ben Groves. Well, Mr. Groves, I'd take it kindly if you'd keep you eyes on Mr. Tucket, the boy here, for me. Now, wait a minute, Francis began. There's a fair chance I won't be coming back from this ride, Mr. Grimes went on, ignoring Francis. Fact is, he's kind of headstrong, and if somebody doesn't watch him, he's likely to do just about anything. Understand me, Mr. Groves? The red-headed man nodded. He motioned to the other 2 men, and before Francis could move, they had grabbed him, pulled him from his horse, and were holding him fast. Hey, he yelled, wait a minute. Mr. Grimes, you can't just go out there and jump a whole tribe of Pawnee. He tried to wiggle free, but failed. They'll kill you. That's dumb. You can't do that, Mr. Grimes. You can't be dumb. You wouldn't let me be dumb. Now, Mr. Tucket, you're rattling on, and that won't do it all. Mr. Groves, if I don't come back by morning, my saddle, all these beaver pelts, and the ponies belong to the boy. I'd be happy if he'd make sure he gets them. Not, of course, that anybody'd be foolish enough to try to take them away from him. No, Francis yelled. Also, the mountain man continued, would your train be going to Oregon? Mr. Groves nodded. The Willamette Valley. The boy's got folks out there. You might take him with you. Maybe make him work his way. No, no. I'll do everything you ask, the farmer answered. I'll hand-deliver him with his pelts to his folks if you won't. But I'd rather be riding out with you. No, Mr. Groves. It just takes one. Two, and they'd kill us both. One, and I might get close enough by insulting Braid. No, Francis screamed again. Even if you win, you lose. For what? There's no reason to die. It's done, Mr. Grimes. And done is done. And now, Mr. Tucket, the mountain man turned at last to Francis, before I go, and I don't want you getting some kind of swelled head out of this, I'd like to say it's been sort of fun having you around. Be seeing you. He wheeled his horse and started off northeast, riding loose and fast. Mr. Grimes, come back, Francis yelled after him. Come back, come back, come back. But Footloose, without saddle, gained speed rapidly before Francis could think the mountain man had vanished in the dying evening light. Francis rode hard. It was a strange mount, but he now knew how to ride well enough to stay on almost any horse. This one was a big, black, long-legged, and fresh, and stolen. An hour after Mr. Grimes had gone, just after moonrise, Mr. Groves had made the mistake of not watching Francis closely. In a flash, he had run to the corral, thrown a war bridle on the black, and with nothing but his rifle, had left camp. The trail, cut in the snow and lighted by the half moon, was easy to follow, but the hour lead Mr. Grimes had on him worried Francis. Footloose had been tired, it was true, but without a saddle, and considering also that Footloose was a big horse, it was entirely possible that Mr. Grimes would catch up to the Pawnees before Francis could catch up to him. Francis drove the horse hard. Every time the black even thought of slowing, he laid his rifle barrel with a vengeance across the gelding's rump. What exactly he was going to do when and if he caught up with the mountain man, Francis wasn't sure. Try to stop him, of course, but if he couldn't talk Mr. Grimes out of tangling with Braid, then at least help him. 2 guns were better than 1. 2 hours of riding brought the moon higher and made it practically as light as day when it was actually almost 10 o'clock at night. 10 o'clock, Francis thought, goading the black to even longer strides. How I've changed. There was a time when 10 o'clock at night meant getting wrapped in a huge quilt and bundled in bed and feeling the warmth leave my face as the fire and the wood stove died. There was a time when I didn't even think of things that died. I didn't know anything about all this killing. Nothing died, ever, except a farm animal now and then. He pushed these thoughts from his mind. They were making him afraid that he might not catch up. There would be times later when he would wonder about all the little things that kept him from reaching Mr. Grimes in time. If he had beat the black harder or tried to make his break from the wagon train earlier. As it was, he was only a split second late. The time that it takes a man to pull a trigger. He rode over a rise, and there, in a small flat meadow, were Braid and Mr. Grimes. They were riding hard at each other, and in the moonlight, the snow flying up around their horses as they closed looked like a fine spray thrown up in the front of a ship. They were both stripped to the waist and carrying rifles. When the horses were 50 feet apart, the 2 men fired. Francis saw the rifles flash, and both men tumbled from their horse. They had fired at that same instant, and the one-armed and one-braided men landed within 10 feet of each other. Francis' mind went blank when the mountain man fell from his horse. He rode up, dismounted, and if he noticed the 15 mounted warriors on the other side of the battlefield, he gave no sign of it. He didn't care. Howdy, Mr. Tucket, the mountain man said, wincing as he pulled himself to a sitting position. His shoulder was turning red. I sort of figured you'd be along. Glad you would make it in time for the fun. He winced again. Francis tore his shirt off and wrapped it around the shoulder. Mr. Grimes pushed him away. No, Mr. Tucket. Not done yet. He propped himself on one knee, then slowly stood, grunting and weaving. What do you mean? Francis asked. Braid's dead. He pointed to where the Indian lay in the snow. The mounted warriors were now around the body in a half circle. It's done. Not done yet, Mr. Grimes repeated, staggering. He pulled out a skinning knife. One more thing to do. Weaving drunkenly, he made his way to the body of his enemy. Then he leaned down. No, Francis screamed. You can't. He ran and pulled the mountain man away. This, somehow, was worse than all the rest. To kill Braid was one thing, perhaps even right in the cold-blooded justice that ruled the prairie, but then this animal thing, he was going to scalp him. Can't, Mr. Tucket, Mr. Grimes said, laughing hoarsely. And why not? He would have done the same to me. Francis stared in horror and then turned away. Many things were suddenly clear to him, and the biggest was that Mr. Grimes was right. He could do what he was doing simply because he was ruled by the same law that ruled Braid. He was of the prairie, the land, the mountains, and was, in a way, a kind of animal. It was not wrong, not for Jason Grimes, but for Francis Alphonse Tucket, for someone from a farm in Missouri, for someone with a family waiting in Oregon. There were different rules for different people. One set for Mr. Grimes, but Francis thought as he reached his horse, there was a different set for him. He was not, and did not want to be, a mountain man. He mounted the horse. Mr. Grimes would be all right, he knew. Fight had been fair in the Indians' eyes, and besides, they wanted to keep on trading for powder. No, the Indians wouldn't kill Mr. Grimes, and his shoulder would heal. Soon he would be trapping again. But this time without me, Francis told himself, squaring his shoulders. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. A boy named Francis Alphonse Tucket might stay and live wild and follow the beaver ponds, but Francis Alphonse Tucket wasn't a boy anymore. Mr. Grimes had made that boy Mr. Tucket, and Mr. Tucket was going to Oregon, to his family, to his kind of life, to his set of rules. Francis slapped the horse as hard as he could and headed for the wagon train. And somehow he knew he'd better not look back at Mr. Grimes, not even to wave goodbye. That was the end of Mr. Tucket. What a great story. Bye.